Stepmother sells the girl to another family. 1 year later the father returns from a business trip.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Anthony stepped into the airport, his eyes filled with sadness but also a hint of determination. This wasn't the first time he was leaving his homeland for work, but this time felt different. Anthony turned around to look at Lauren and Sophia, his little daughter who had just turned 3, tightly holding his hand. "Sophia, you need to be good and listen to your mom, Lauren," Anthony said gently as he crouched down to her level. "I promise I'll be back soon." The little girl looked up, her clear eyes shining like crystal, trying hard to hold back her tears. "Will you really come back, Daddy?" Sophia asked, her voice trembling. Standing beside her, Lauren wore her usual gentle expression. She placed a hand on Sophia's shoulder and smiled faintly. "Anthony, don't worry. I'll take good care of Sophia. We'll be waiting for you to return." Anthony smiled, feeling somewhat reassured. He bent down and hugged his daughter tightly one last time before walking through the security checkpoint. "I love you, Sophia. Always remember that." As Anthony's figure disappeared, the smile on Lauren's face also faded. She sighed, taking Sophia's hand, but her expression revealed a hint of irritation. "Let's go home, Sophia. We don't have all day." On the way back, Sophia kept gazing out the car window, her eyes filled with sadness and longing. Lauren, on the other hand, was entirely different. She kept glancing at her phone, texting her friends. One message she sent read, "Finally, he's gone. Freedom at last." When they arrived home, Lauren left Sophia to play alone in the living room. "You just play by yourself. I've got things to do," she said without even looking at the little girl. Sophia obediently sat in a corner, clutching the doll Anthony had given her before he left. She loved her dad and trusted Lauren, believing Lauren would genuinely take care of her. But as time passed, Lauren's sweet words became fewer and fewer, replaced by increasing coldness. A week later, Lauren invited her best friend, Carmen, over to the house. Carmen, a woman around Lauren's age with an air of arrogance and a mocking tone, glanced at Sophia playing quietly in the corner. "Living with your husband's kid must be a pain, huh?" Carmen asked with a smirk. Lauren shrugged, replying indifferently, "It's annoying, but what can I do? Anthony trusts me. He thinks I'm an angel." Both burst out laughing, not noticing that Sophia had overheard them. The little girl turned away, pretending not to understand, but her tiny heart felt the sting of rejection. That night, Lauren lost her temper when she saw Sophia crying because she missed her father. "Sophia, enough. Your dad isn't here, so stop bothering me," she shouted. Sophia's cries only grew louder, which further irritated Lauren. In the days that followed, Lauren began neglecting Sophia more and more. The little girl's breakfast was often just a dry piece of bread, and Lauren frequently left her home alone to meet up with friends. One time, Sophia tried to grab Lauren's hand before she left. "Mom, please don't go. I'm scared to be alone," Sophia said, her eyes filled with hope. Lauren pushed the little girl's hand away and sighed. "Sophia, you can't cling to me forever. Grow up already." Sophia pulled her hand back, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know what else to do but sit quietly, hugging her doll tighter. One afternoon, while Sophia was playing in the yard, she met Miguel, the neighborhood mailman. Miguel, a kind middle-aged man with a warm smile, stopped when he saw Sophia sitting sadly in a corner. "Why aren't you playing with your friends?" Miguel asked kindly. Sophia looked up and shook her head. "I don't have any friends. I only have Daddy, but he's far away." Miguel frowned slightly, sensing something was wrong. "Where's your mom?" Sophia lowered her head, not answering. Miguel sighed, knowing he couldn't intervene too much, but he felt sorry for the little girl. Before leaving, he placed a small candy in Sophia's hand. Here, take this. Don't be sad, okay? Sophia smiled faintly, but that smile quickly disappeared when Lauren appeared. Miguel, you don't need to be overly friendly. Sophia has everything she needs, Lauren said coldly. Miguel nodded, but his eyes reflected doubt. After he left, Lauren turned to Sophia and scolded her. Don't talk to strangers, understand? Sophia nodded, clutching the candy in her hand like a precious treasure. She didn't understand why everything had become so difficult. When Anthony was here, everything was warm and happy. Now, all that remained was sadness and loneliness. Lauren stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her flawless makeup. The tight red dress she wore exuded elegance and allure. She smiled in satisfaction at her reflection, then grabbed the luxury handbag on the table. Sophia, I'm going out for a bit. Don't mess up the house. Lauren called down to the living room without bothering to look. Sophia was huddled in the corner, holding her worn-out doll. She replied softly, yes, ma'am. Lauren slammed the door shut without caring whether Sophia had eaten or not. The house fell silent, with only the ticking clock and Sophia's soft breathing. The little girl looked up at Anthony's photo on the table, her eyes filled with unending longing. Daddy, when will you come back? Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. As time went on, Lauren grew colder and more indifferent. Meals were sparse, and harsh words became routine. Sophia grew quieter, playing alone more often. She had tried to make Lauren happy by drawing pictures for her or tidying up her toys neatly, but all she received in return were cold, indifferent looks. One day, Lauren sat in a fancy cafe, across from Carmen. They were chatting animatedly, their laughter echoing through the corner of the cafe. You know, I really can't stand that kid anymore, Lauren complained, stirring her coffee lightly. Being a stepmom isn't easy. Carmen raised an eyebrow and smirked. Then why don't you find a way to lighten your load? Anthony's not here. Lauren sighed, a calculating glint flashing in her eyes. You know, I heard about a wealthy family looking to adopt a child. They're willing to pay a lot. Carmen took a sip of coffee, raising her eyebrows slightly. You mean? Lauren smirked and shook her head gently. I'm just saying, if Sophia could live with a richer family, she'd be happier. And I'd be more comfortable. Carmen stared at Lauren for a moment, then shrugged. It's up to you. As long as it makes sense to you. From that moment, the idea of selling Sophia lingered in Lauren's mind. She began searching for information, asking around about wealthy families looking to adopt. A week later, Lauren met the Johnson family, a wealthy couple living in the outskirts of Miami. The couple couldn't have children and wanted to nurture a well-behaved child. I just want a child who listens. No noise, no trouble, Mrs. Johnson said coldly. Lauren smiled and skillfully reassured them. Sophia is a very obedient girl. I think you'll be pleased. The arrangement was quickly finalized. Lauren received a large sum of money as an initial care expense. That night, Lauren packed Sophia's belongings, just a few old clothes and her only doll. Sophia, we're going somewhere else. You'll have lots of nice toys there, Lauren said, her voice feigning gentleness. Sophia looked at her stepmother in confusion. But I want to stay home and wait for Daddy. Lauren suppressed a sigh and bent down to console Sophia. Your father will be so happy to know you're living a better life. Come on, let's go. A black car pulled up in front of the house. Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Johnson sat expressionless, waiting. Lauren carried Sophia into the car without looking back. She coldly said, "Take good care of her. I don't want any trouble." The car door closed, and Sophia's small figure gradually disappeared behind the dark-tinted windows. She screamed, her voice choked with sobs, "Daddy! Daddy, help me!" Lauren stood there, her eyes vacant, indifferent to Sophia's cries as they faded into the night. Back at home, Lauren sank into the sofa and took a sip of red wine. She glanced around the silent house and smiled faintly. Finally, some peace and quiet. But somewhere in the stillness, it was as if the sound of Sophia's sobs lingered, distant and haunting. The black car sped down the empty road, leaving behind the faint glow of Miami's city lights. Inside, Sophia huddled in a corner of the back seat, her terrified eyes fixed on the unfamiliar woman beside her. "Sit still and stop crying," Mrs. Johnson said coldly, her eyes glancing at Sophia through the rearview mirror. Sophia whimpered, clutching her worn doll tightly to her chest. "I want to go back to Daddy. I don't want to go anywhere else." Mrs. Johnson sighed and turned to the driver. "Hurry up. I don't want to drag this out any longer." The driver, a man named Richard, simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. He said nothing, his expression devoid of sympathy. To him, this was just another job like any other. The car came to a stop in front of a large mansion on the outskirts of the city. The heavy iron gates slowly opened, revealing a sprawling yet lifeless garden. Sophia was pulled out of the car, her small legs trembling with fear. "This will be your home from now on," Mrs. Johnson said icily. "If you don't want any trouble, stay quiet." The large doors closed behind Sophia. Inside, the mansion was dark and cold, a stark contrast to its grand exterior. Sophia was led to a small room that contained only an old bed and a rickety wooden table. "This is your room. Don't wander around the house. Tomorrow, you'll have chores to do," Mrs. Johnson said before slamming the door shut. Sophia sat down on the bed, clutching her doll tightly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't understand why she was there or when her father would come to get her. In the darkness, only the soft sobs of an abandoned child could be heard. The next morning, Sophia was startled awake by loud banging on the door. "Get up, quickly," a harsh voice called out. It was Lucia, the longtime housekeeper for the Johnson family. Her expression was unfriendly, her eyes cold as she looked at Sophia. "Go to the kitchen and wash the dishes. Don't be lazy," Lucia ordered before turning and walking away. Sophia quietly followed, her small legs trembling on the cold stone floor. In the kitchen, a mountain of dirty dishes was piled high. Lucia pointed at the sink. "Here, start with this. When you're done, mop the floors. If you don't do a good job, the mistress will be furious." Sophia didn't understand why she had to do these tasks. She only knew to lower her head and comply, her small hands trembling as they touched the freezing water. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks, blending with the flowing water. That evening, Sophia sat curled up in a corner of her room, her body exhausted. She thought of the days when her father would hold her close and tell her bedtime stories. Now, all she had was darkness and cold indifference. One day, while Sophia was mopping the floors, she accidentally knocked over an expensive vase. The sound of it shattering echoed sharply through the house. Mrs. Johnson stormed down the stairs, her face furious. "What did you do?" Terrified, Sophia stammered, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Ignoring her explanation, Mrs. Johnson raised her hand and slapped Sophia hard across the face. "Useless brat. If this happens again, you'll regret it." Lucia watched from a distance, a fleeting look of pity crossing her face before she turned away. She knew all too well the temperament of her employers and that no one could intervene. Sophia sat on the floor, her cheek burning, tears streaming down her face. She hugged her doll tightly and whispered desperately, "Daddy, please save me." Day after day, Sophia was treated like a servant in the cold mansion. She was forced to do endless chores, from scrubbing floors to washing dishes and tending the garden. No one talked to her or played with her. Every night, Sophia would huddle in a corner of her bed, clutching her doll and hoping for a miracle. One cold morning, Lucia dragged Sophia out of bed with a loud scolding. "Get up now. Today you have to scrub the entire hallway. The mistress doesn't want to see a single speck of dirt." Sophia rubbed her tired eyes and nodded weakly. Her tiny hands were already calloused from the cold water and harsh cleaning chemicals. Lucia tossed her a filthy rag. "Hurry up. I don't want to hear any complaints from the mistress." While she was on her knees scrubbing the floor, she heard heavy footsteps approaching. It was Mr. Johnson, a silent man whose gaze was always icy. He glanced at Sophia and frowned. "Isn't she finished yet?" Mr. Johnson asked. Lucia quickly bowed her head. "Sir, she's still a child, so she's a bit slow." Mr. Johnson scoffed coldly. "If she doesn't do her work properly, cut her food rations." Sophia flinched at his words, lowering her head even further as she tried to scrub faster. She didn't dare look up, biting her lip to hold back tears. That night, Sophia's dinner consisted of just a piece of dry bread and a glass of water. From a distance, she watched the Johnson family enjoy a lavish meal, her stomach growling, but she didn't dare complain. Mrs. Johnson glanced at Sophia and said indifferently, "This is enough for you. Don't expect anything more." Lucia stood nearby, her expression briefly softening. She knew her mistress was overly harsh but didn't dare interfere for fear of losing her job. Sophia lowered her head, slowly chewing the dry piece of bread, swallowing her sadness. That night, Sophia clutched her worn, tattered doll tightly, whispering, "Daddy. I'm so scared. I want to go home." Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the windows, as if responding to the quiet sobs of the small, lonely child trapped in the cold mansion. One day, while Sophia was sweeping the yard, a strange man appeared at the gate. It was Michael, the estate's former gardener, who had been recently called back to work after a long absence. He was in his 50s, thin but with kind eyes. He saw Sophia hunched over, sweeping leaves, and looked at her with surprise. "Who are you? Why are you doing this work?" Sophia looked up and stammered, "I'm Sophia." Michael frowned, glanced around, then lowered his voice. "A little girl like you shouldn't be doing these things." Sophia lowered her head, not daring to answer. Michael sighed and stepped closer. "Don't you have anyone to take care of you?" Before Sophia could respond, Lucia came out of the house, her voice sharp. "Michael, don't meddle in things that aren't your business." Michael glanced at Lucia but said nothing more. He returned to his work, though his eyes lingered on Sophia, filled with suspicion and concern. That evening, while tidying up the backyard, Michael found Sophia quietly wiping her tears. He gently asked, "Would you like to send a letter to someone? I can help." Sophia looked up, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. I want to write to my dad, but I don't know his address." Michael froze for a moment, his eyes heavy with thought. "Who is your father?" Sophia whispered softly, "Anthony. Anthony Castillo." Hearing that name, Michael stood still, stunned. He knew Anthony, a renowned civil engineer. He recalled that Anthony had once lived in this estate with his wife and daughter. But why was only this little girl left now? Michael knelt down, his voice gentle. "I'll find a way to help you. But you must be very careful. Don't let anyone know." Sophia nodded slightly, a small light of hope flickering in her heart. But that hope was quickly extinguished when Lucia approached from afar, her gaze sharp and wary. "Michael, don't make me remind you again," Lucia said sternly. Michael merely nodded and walked away. Yet his heart was burdened with growing doubts about what was happening in the Johnson mansion. In the days that followed, Sophia remained trapped in an endless cycle of chores. The Johnson family's treatment of her grew increasingly harsh. Mrs. Johnson demanded Sophia take on heavier tasks, even forcing her to clean the filthy dog kennels in the backyard. One afternoon, as Sophia struggled to drag a large trash bag outside, she slipped and fell to the ground, scraping her knee. Blood oozed from the wound as Sophia bit her lip, trying not to cry. But Michael, nearby, saw everything. He approached quietly and handed her a handkerchief. "Use this to clean it up." Sophia hesitantly accepted it, murmuring, "Thank you." Michael glanced around and lowered his voice. "I'll find a way to contact your father. Don't lose hope." Those words were like a small light piercing through the darkness of Sophia's life. But could Michael do anything against the cruelty of the Johnson family? Dark clouds gathered in the sky, signaling an approaching storm. Much like Sophia's current life, bleak and seemingly without escape. Cold rain began pouring over Miami, accompanied by winds that whistled through the cracks of the Johnson mansion. Sophia curled up in her small, narrow room, the thin blanket barely enough to keep her frail body warm. She clutched her old, tattered doll tightly, her silent tears soaking the pillow. Outside, Lucia was busy cleaning the kitchen, the sound of dishes clinking echoing through the house. She glanced at the clock and muttered to herself, "It's almost time for the mistress to check. If I don't finish, I'll be in trouble." Michael entered, carrying a bundle of firewood. He sighed quietly as he saw Lucia scurrying around. "She makes that little girl work all day without rest, doesn't she?" Lucia paused, glancing at Michael. "Mind your own business, Michael. I don't want to get involved." Michael frowned. "But she's just a child." Lucia sighed, her voice softening. "Do you think I don't feel bad? But if I speak up, Mrs. Johnson will fire me. I have my own family to worry about." Michael didn't respond, only staring silently toward the staircase leading to Sophia's cold, lonely room. His fists clenched, his expression troubled. One particularly cold morning, Mrs. Johnson called Sophia down to the living room. Sophia walked slowly, clutching her doll tightly, her eyes filled with fear. "Give me that doll," Mrs. Johnson commanded coldly. Sophia flinched and stammered, "No, no, ma'am, this is a gift from my dad." Mrs. Johnson gritted her teeth, storming over to snatch the doll from Sophia's hands. "No toys are allowed here. This is a house, not a playground." Sophia burst into tears, trying desperately to hold on, but it was futile. Mrs. Johnson threw the doll into the roaring fireplace. The flames consumed the precious gift in seconds. "No!" Sophia screamed, collapsing to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please, don't." Mrs. Johnson crossed her arms, watching the fire coldly. "Crying won't change anything. If you don't want more punishment, keep quiet and get back to work." Lucia stood in the distance, witnessing the scene. Her eyes showed a fleeting trace of pity, but she still didn't dare speak up. Hearing the commotion, Michael rushed into the room. When he saw what had happened, his fists clenched, and his eyes burned with anger. "You're doing this to a child?" Mrs. Johnson turned to him, her gaze sharp and icy. "This is my house. I can do whatever I want. If you don't like it, the door is open." Michael suppressed his anger, lowered his head, and walked away. But inside, he made a decision: this could not go on. That night, Sophia lay curled up on her cold, hard bed, her tears long dried. Without her doll to hold, she could only curl into herself, trying to drift off to sleep. A soft knock came at the door. "Sophia, are you still awake?" Michael's voice whispered. Sophia opened her eyes, her voice weak. "Mr. Michael." He gently opened the door and slipped in a small handkerchief. "I can't replace your doll, but use this to keep warm." Sophia took the handkerchief and held it close to her chest, her eyes sparkling. "Thank you." Michael crouched down and whispered, "I'm trying to get in touch with your father. But it will take time. Stay strong." That promise was like a tiny ray of light in the deep darkness. Sophia nodded gently, clutching the handkerchief tightly, her heart filled with hope. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson assigned Sophia even heavier tasks. Clean the backyard. If I find even a single leaf left, don't expect to eat dinner. Sophia quietly bowed her head, picked up a broom, and headed to the yard. The cold wind bit at her skin as her small, trembling hands swept each dry leaf. Suddenly, Richard, the driver, approached with a stern expression. "Hurry up. The mistress doesn't like to wait," Richard said bluntly. Sophia merely nodded, not daring to respond. Richard turned away without a second glance. From a hidden corner, Michael watched Sophia. He lowered his voice and spoke to Lucia. "I can't stand this anymore. I'm going to contact Anthony." Lucia looked alarmed. "Are you crazy? If Mrs. Johnson finds out, we'll both lose our jobs." Michael's expression was firm. "And if we do nothing, that little girl will lose her entire childhood. I can't stay silent anymore." Lucia remained silent, her eyes conflicted. But she didn't stop Michael. That night, Michael quietly left the mansion, carrying a slip of paper with Anthony's information that Sophia had secretly given him. He went to a small post office in the outskirts and sent a brief letter. "Anthony Castillo. Your daughter, Sophia, is in danger. Please return as soon as possible. A friend." After sending the letter, Michael exhaled deeply. He knew this was Sophia's last hope. Though he wasn't sure if Anthony would receive it, at least he had done the right thing. When Michael returned to the mansion, he felt a sense of relief. But he didn't realize that behind the door, Mrs. Johnson had been standing there, her gaze icy and piercing. "What were you doing out so late, Michael?" she asked, her tone cold as ice. Michael froze, his heart racing. "I just stepped out for some fresh air." Mrs. Johnson narrowed her eyes and smirked coldly. "I hope that's all it was." Michael swallowed hard and quickly entered the house, knowing things would not be easy from now on. Winter's chill continued to envelop the Johnson mansion. The wind howled through the old windows, sounding like distant cries. Sophia huddled on her freezing bed, clutching the handkerchief Michael had given her, trying to find warmth amid the biting cold. That morning, Mrs. Johnson descended the stairs in a foul mood. "Lucia. Where is that girl? Why isn't she up and working yet?" she snapped. Lucia quickly bowed her head. "I'll wake her right away." Hesitating slightly, Lucia went upstairs to Sophia's room. Gently pushing the door open, she saw the little girl still curled up, her face pale. Lucia sighed softly. "Get up, Sophia. The mistress is angry." Sophia slowly sat up, her weary eyes meeting Lucia's. "I'm so tired." Lucia paused, taking in Sophia's frail frame and sunken cheeks from hunger. A pang of pity rose in her chest, but all she could manage was a quiet, "Try your best, or you'll face even worse trouble." Downstairs, Mrs. Johnson grew more impatient. She turned to Richard, her tone harsh. "If that girl doesn't listen, I'll send her to an orphanage. Let someone else deal with her." Richard nodded indifferently. "It's up to you." From the corner of the yard, Michael overheard the conversation. He clenched his fists tightly, anger welling up inside him. But he knew that acting impulsively would ruin any chance of helping Sophia. Meanwhile, Sophia trudged to the garden, struggling to sweep leaves as usual. The cold wind lashed at her face, and her small hands trembled as she gripped the broom. Suddenly, a dry leaf blew past her, carrying with it a small piece of paper that landed near her feet. She bent down to pick it up. On the paper, in Michael's scrawled handwriting, were the words, "Stay patient. Your father will return soon." Sophia glanced around, her wide eyes filled with surprise. Clutching the note to her chest, she whispered, "Daddy. I'll wait for you." Her moment of hope was quickly interrupted by Lucia's sharp voice from a distance. Get back to work. Stop daydreaming. Startled, Sophia quickly tucked the note into her pocket and bowed her head, resuming her sweeping. That night, after the mansion had fallen silent, Michael quietly slipped into the kitchen to find food for Sophia. He knew she had been denied proper meals for days. He grabbed a piece of stale bread and an apple, then crept upstairs to Sophia's room. Knocking softly on the door, he whispered, "Sophia, it's me." Sophia cracked the door open, her eyes lighting up when she saw Michael. He handed her the food and said in a low voice, "Eat this. Don't let anyone find out." Tears welled up in Sophia's eyes as she took the food with trembling hands. "Thank you, you're so kind to me." Michael gently patted her head. "You have to stay strong. I've already sent a letter to your father. Just hold on a little longer." Sophia nodded, her heart brimming with hope. But elsewhere in the mansion, Richard stood hidden behind a corner, his cold eyes observing Michael's every move. The next morning, Mrs. Johnson summoned Michael to the living room. She sat with her legs crossed, her cold gaze fixed on him. "I heard you went out last night," she said. Michael remained composed. "I only went to buy some supplies for my gardening work." Mrs. Johnson narrowed her eyes, a faint, mocking smile on her lips. "I hope that's all it was. I don't want my employees meddling in things that don't concern them." Michael bowed slightly. "I understand." But he knew that Mrs. Johnson had begun to grow suspicious. He would have to be even more careful if he didn't want all his efforts to go to waste. That afternoon, Richard was assigned by Mrs. Johnson to deliver goods to the city. Before leaving, Richard secretly handed her a letter he had forged, mimicking Michael's handwriting. The letter accused Michael of plotting against her. "Ma'am, you should be aware of what's happening," Richard said coldly. Mrs. Johnson read the letter, her expression darkening. "I'll take care of this myself." Meanwhile, Michael was planning his next move. He knew Anthony would need more details to find Sophia. Determined, he decided to try calling Anthony directly, even though he knew it was a risky move. Late that night, Michael sneaked into Mr. Johnson's office, searching for the landline phone. But before he could dial, Lucia suddenly appeared. "What are you doing here?" Lucia asked, her eyes filled with confusion. Michael turned around, lowering his voice. "I need to call Anthony. There's no time left." Lucia hesitated but then shook her head. "If the mistress finds out, we're both done for." Michael looked deeply into Lucia's eyes. "If we do nothing, the girl won't make it through this winter." Lucia remained silent for a long moment, then nodded. "Hurry up." Michael quickly dialed the international number he found in Anthony's files. The ringing seemed to stretch endlessly. "Hello." A distant male voice answered. It was one of Anthony's colleagues. Michael spoke urgently, "Please, pass a message to Mr. Anthony Castillo. His daughter, Sophia, is in danger. I'm the gardener at the Johnson estate." There was a pause on the other end. "I'll let him know immediately." Michael sighed in relief, putting down the receiver. But at that very moment, Mrs. Johnson stood in the doorway, her eyes blazing. "What are you doing, Michael?" she asked sharply, stepping closer. Lucia, panicking, stepped in front of Michael. "Ma'am, you misunderstood." Mrs. Johnson sneered. "Misunderstood? I don't think so. Are you two betraying me?" Michael clenched his fists. "I'm just doing what's right." Mrs. Johnson narrowed her eyes. "Then you'll pay for it." The air grew tense. Sophia quietly peered through the crack in the door, her heart pounding. She sensed the danger in the atmosphere. The glimmer of hope she had felt was now on the brink of extinguishing. The airplane touched down at Miami Airport under the dazzling early morning sun. Anthony grabbed his suitcase and hurried out of the terminal, his heart racing. For the past 3 years, he had lived under the belief that Sophia was happy with Lauren. But the anonymous letter Anthony had recently received shattered that belief. Your daughter, Sophia, is in danger. Come back as soon as possible. Anthony clenched the crumpled piece of paper in his hand. He couldn't believe that Lauren could harm Sophia. But his gut told him something terrible had happened. He called for a taxi, his voice urgent. Take me to Velasquez Avenue. Quickly. The car sped through the streets of Miami. Anthony couldn't stop blaming himself. I trusted Lauren too much. Why didn't I check more thoroughly over these 3 years? He recalled the brief phone calls, Lauren's vague explanations. Everything now seemed suspicious. As soon as he stepped out of the car, Anthony rushed into the house. The interior was still luxurious and tidy, but it felt eerily cold. Lauren was sitting on the sofa, calmly sipping a glass of wine. Anthony. You're back. Why didn't you tell me in advance? Lauren asked, trying to sound natural. Anthony stared at Lauren, his voice low. Where is Sophia, Lauren? I want to see her right now. Lauren looked momentarily flustered but quickly regained her composure. Oh, Sophia, she's with your relatives. I told you that already. Anthony stepped closer, his eyes cold. Which relatives? I just called all of them, and no one knows anything about Sophia. Lauren's face turned pale, her mouth opening and closing without words. Anthony didn't give her time to come up with an excuse. He went to the desk, rummaging through the drawers, and found a stack of papers. Among them was a bank transfer receipt from Lauren's account to a family named Johnson. Anthony gripped the paper tightly, his voice firm. Explain this, Lauren. What is this? Lauren was at a loss for words. She knew she couldn't hide the truth any longer. You don't understand. I was only trying to do what's best for you. Sophia, she was too much trouble for me. I thought sending her away was better. Slam. Anthony slammed his hand on the table, his eyes blazing with anger. What did you do to her? Lauren backed away, trembling. Anthony didn't say another word. He left the house in a rush, clutching the address of the Johnson family. His heart felt like it was about to burst. She's somewhere out there, scared and alone. I have to find her now. The car stopped in front of the heavy iron gates of the Johnson estate. Anthony jumped out and pounded on the door. Bang! 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 The door opened, and Mrs. Johnson stood there, her gaze cold. Who are you? Anthony clenched his fists. I'm Sophia's father. Bring her out here right now. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, her eyes wavering. But she quickly regained her composure and said calmly, You're mistaken. There's no one named Sophia here. Anthony had no patience left. He pushed past the door, shouting, Sophia. Where are you? Mrs. Johnson signaled Richard to block Anthony, but he didn't stop. He ran through the vast house, desperately calling his daughter's name. From upstairs, Sophia heard someone calling her name, a familiar voice she thought she'd only hear in her dreams. Her eyes widened, tears streaming down her face. Daddy! Sophia screamed, rushing out of the small room. Anthony froze, seeing his frail, pale little girl. He couldn't hold back his tears and ran to embrace her tightly. Sophia! My sweet girl! Anthony choked out. Sophia clung to him, sobbing. Daddy! I was so scared. I want to go home. Anthony held her close, feeling her trembling body. He looked at Mrs. Johnson with fury in his eyes. I won't let this go. You will pay for this. Anthony growled. Richard stepped forward to stop him, but Anthony raised a finger at him. Don't touch me unless you want the police involved. Without hesitation, Anthony carried Sophia out of the gloomy house. He pulled out his phone and called the police. "Hello. I need to report a crime. My wife sold my daughter to a family. They need to be arrested immediately." Mrs. Johnson turned pale, realizing she couldn't escape. Richard stepped back, unable to meet Anthony's fiery gaze. Anthony brought Sophia to the hospital for a checkup. The doctors diagnosed her with severe malnutrition and emotional trauma. Anthony sat by her hospital bed, holding her tiny hand. "I'm so sorry, Sophia. I let you suffer too much," he whispered. Sophia gave a weak smile. "You're here now. I'm not scared anymore." Anthony kissed her forehead, tears streaming down his face. He vowed to himself that he would never let Sophia endure any more pain. That same day, the police raided the Johnson estate. Mrs. Johnson and Richard were arrested for child trafficking. Lauren was also charged for her involvement. Everyone who had hurt Sophia would face justice. Standing by the hospital window, Anthony looked out at the vast blue sky. From this moment on, he knew that he and Sophia would start a new life, one full of hope and love. Sunlight streamed gently through the hospital room window, softly lighting Sophia's small face. Anthony sat beside her, holding her frail hands tightly. He gently stroked her soft hair, his heart heavy with regret. "I'll never leave you again, Sophia. I promise," Anthony whispered, his eyes filled with determination. Sophia smiled faintly, her eyes still weary. "Don't leave again, Daddy. I'm scared." Anthony leaned down and kissed her forehead. "I'm here now. No one will hurt you anymore." The door to the hospital room creaked open, and Chief Pablo entered. He was a stocky middle-aged man with a stern expression. Pablo nodded at Anthony. "We've arrested Lauren, Mrs. Johnson, and the driver Richard. They're being investigated for child trafficking and child abuse," Pablo said firmly. Anthony nodded, clenching his fists. "Thank you. I want them to pay for what they did to my daughter." Pablo sighed. "We'll do everything we can. But I need your cooperation to provide more evidence, especially regarding Lauren's financial transactions." Anthony nodded. "I'll hand over everything I've found. They won't escape justice." The police chief left, leaving Anthony and Sophia in quiet solitude. Anthony looked at his daughter, his heart filled with resolve. "Not just finding you, but getting justice for you." At the police station, Lauren sat in the interrogation room, her face pale. Across from her sat Detective Lucia Morales, a sharp and experienced investigator. Lucia crossed her arms, her eyes cold. "Lauren Martinez, you're charged with child trafficking and fraud. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Lucia asked sharply. Lauren trembled, trying to maintain her composure. I didn't mean to. I just thought sending her to a better place." Lucia narrowed her eyes and threw a stack of documents onto the table. "A better place? To be abused and exploited? Here is a receipt showing a money transfer from your account to the Johnson family. Explain this." Lauren remained silent, unable to come up with any defense. She knew she couldn't deny her crimes. Lucia leaned back in her chair, her voice cold. "I suggest you cooperate. Otherwise, you'll face the harshest sentence." Lauren lowered her head, her voice cracking. I was persuaded by Mrs. Johnson. She said she'd take better care of Sophia than I could." Lucia smirked, her tone dripping with disdain. "So, you admit to selling your husband's daughter?" Lauren stayed silent, unable to deny or defend herself. Meanwhile, at the Johnson mansion, the police combed through every corner of the property. Michael, the loyal gardener, stood at the gate, his eyes filled with satisfaction as he watched justice unfold. Inspector Pablo stepped outside and nodded at Michael. "Thank you for sending that letter. Without your actions, we might not have uncovered this case. Michael bowed humbly. I only did what needed to be done. Sophia didn't deserve to suffer like that. Pablo gently patted his shoulder. People like you make the world a better place. Inside, Mrs. Johnson was led out in handcuffs, her face pale and devoid of her former arrogance and power. Richard kept his head low, knowing that all their crimes had come to light. Anthony brought Sophia back to their beloved home. Though it had been empty for 3 years, the house still held all their cherished memories. Anthony stepped inside, carrying Sophia in his arms. Welcome home, Sophia, Anthony said warmly. Sophia looked around, her eyes wide. Our house, it's just like I remember. Anthony smiled softly and stroked her hair. I've kept everything the same, waiting for you to come back so we can be happy together again. He placed Sophia on the sofa and gently covered her with a soft blanket. What would you like to eat? I'll cook for you. Sophia hesitated before smiling shyly. Can you make spaghetti, like before? Anthony laughed. Of course, my little princess. I'll make the best spaghetti you've ever had. In the kitchen, Anthony busily prepared dinner. The aroma of the food filled the house, creating a cozy and comforting atmosphere. Sophia sat on the sofa, watching her father with a peaceful heart. That evening, the two of them shared a joyful dinner, laughter echoing through the house. For the first time in 3 years, Sophia felt truly safe and at peace. The next day, Anthony and his lawyer, Elena Delgado, went to court to complete the legal proceedings. Elena, a tough yet compassionate lawyer, reviewed the case files and turned to Anthony. With the evidence we have, Lauren and the Johnson family will face the maximum punishment. But we'll still need you to testify. Anthony nodded, his eyes resolute. I'll do whatever it takes to ensure they can't harm anyone else ever again. The trial was tense. Lauren, Mrs. Johnson, and Richard stood before the judge, their heads bowed as the charges were read. Anthony stood up, his voice ringing strong and clear. I ask for nothing more than justice for my daughter. No one has the right to take away her childhood and happiness. The judge struck the gavel, delivering the verdict. Lauren was sentenced to 8 years in prison, Mrs. Johnson to 10 years, and Richard to 5 years. The courtroom fell silent, the decisive sound of the gavel echoing. Anthony exhaled deeply in relief. He turned to Elena and nodded his thanks. Elena smiled. Justice has been served. Anthony returned home and held Sophia tightly in his arms. He promised her that all the bad times were over. Sophia whispered, Daddy, I'm so happy. Anthony kissed her forehead and replied, So am I, Sophia. The two of them sat together, sunlight streaming through the window, marking a new beginning, one filled with hope, love, and happiness. Soft sunlight filtered through the window, warming the cozy room. Sophia sat in an armchair, holding a new teddy bear that Anthony had bought for her. Her eyes no longer held fear but were instead filled with pure joy. Anthony sat across from her, his gaze tender as he watched his daughter. Sophia, would you like to go to the park today? I heard there's a small fair nearby, Anthony suggested with a smile. Sophia's face lit up, and she nodded eagerly. Yes, I want to go. Will you buy me cotton candy? Anthony laughed heartily and ruffled her hair. Of course. I'll buy you all the cotton candy you want. The two of them got ready and left the house together. Golden sunlight bathed the streets, and the fresh air carried a sense of a new beginning. Sophia chatted excitedly with her father along the way, her innocence gradually returning to her face. At the park, Anthony bought her a large cotton candy and took her to the rides. Sophia's giggles filled the air, making Anthony's heart swell with emotion. He realized that these simple moments were the most precious. After playing to their heart's content, they rested on a park bench. Anthony gently asked, Do you still have nightmares, Sophia? Sophia shook her head, her eyes bright. No, Daddy. Now that you're here, I'm not afraid of anything anymore. Anthony pulled her into a hug. I'm sorry I didn't protect you better. I'll never let anyone hurt you again. Sophia smiled softly and nestled into his chest. I love you, Daddy. Anthony felt his heart warm. From that moment on, Sophia's happiness became his only priority. Meanwhile, at Miami prison, Lauren sat quietly in her cold, dim cell. Her face was gaunt, and her eyes empty. The days in confinement had made her realize the extent of her foolishness and selfishness, but it was far too late for regret. In the adjacent cell, Mrs. Johnson sat huddled in a corner, stripped of her former pride and haughtiness, avoiding the scornful glares of other inmates. Richard, the driver, was also paying the price for his complicity. Detective Lucia Morales stood outside the cells, her expression icy as she observed them. She murmured to her colleague, "People who hurt children deserve no less than this." Her colleague nodded. "I heard Anthony pursued charges to the fullest extent." Lucia smirked. "Justice has been served. Now it's time for him and his daughter to live happily." Anthony decided to take Sophia to a child psychologist to help her fully recover. Dr. Claire Jimenez, a gentle woman with deeply understanding eyes, welcomed the father and daughter with a warm smile. "Hello, Sophia. Would you like to draw?" "I have lots of pretty crayons," Claire asked softly. Sophia hesitated, glancing at Anthony before nodding shyly. She took the crayons and began to draw. Anthony sat beside her, feeling reassured as he saw his daughter gradually open up. Claire turned to Anthony, her voice calm and soothing. "Sophia will need time to heal completely. But I believe that with your love and support, she will overcome this." Anthony smiled. "I'll do whatever it takes to make her happy." Claire nodded. "Let Sophia feel that she is always loved and safe." One evening, Anthony sat on the balcony, gazing at the night sky. Sophia ran up to him, wrapping her arms around him tightly. "Daddy, I finished my drawing," Sophia exclaimed, holding up the picture she had made. It showed the two of them holding hands under a starry sky. Anthony, moved, took the picture and said softly, "It's beautiful, my little princess." Sophia beamed. "Can we hang it in my room?" Anthony nodded. "This will be my treasure." He carefully hung the drawing on the wall of her room, his eyes shining with happiness. After all the pain, he had finally been able to give Sophia a real home. A few months later, Anthony decided to host a small party to thank those who had helped him during his journey to find Sophia. Michael, Officer Pablo, Lawyer Elena, and Dr. Claire were all in attendance. Anthony stood up and raised his glass. "I want to thank everyone who stood by me. Without you, I couldn't have found my daughter." Michael smiled kindly. "You don't need to thank me. I was just doing the right thing." Pablo nodded. "The important thing is that you and Sophia are reunited now." Sophia ran up to Michael and hugged him. "Thank you, Mr. Michael." Michael crouched down, patting her head gently. "You deserve to be happy, little one." The atmosphere was filled with laughter and warmth. Anthony looked around the room, his heart overflowing with gratitude. Justice had finally been served, and happiness had returned to his family. Anthony leaned down and whispered in Sophia's ear, "I promise I'll always protect you." Sophia giggled. "And I'll always stay by your side." The night sky sparkled with stars, a testament to a new beginning filled with love and hope. Anthony knew that from this moment on, he and his daughter would face life's challenges together. The story of Anthony and his journey to reclaim his daughter Sophia carries a profound lesson about love, responsibility, and justice. Blind trust can lead to devastating consequences, but the love of a father is stronger than any challenge. Anthony never stopped fighting to bring his daughter back and to uphold justice. This story serves as a reminder that we must remain vigilant, care for, and protect our families. It also demonstrates that those who do wrong will face consequences and that justice will always prevail.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.